Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to another Tuesday talk show, and it's taken me a little while to sort of get through this one because I've got a bunch of ideas rattling around for what I want to do in these talk shows, but it actually takes me a little while to sort of flesh out what I want to actually say in specific because I'm pretty bad at this. In any event, what I wanted to talk about this week is anime again, and I'm going to be doing a few more Tuesday talk shows that are about different animes, and in particular, I really liked doing the comparison sort of one about Death Note and Code Geass, so I probably will be trying to frame it in comparing two series as often as possible, because I think that's an interesting way to look at what the strengths and weaknesses of a different series is, especially if I can find ones that are comparable in some way or another. This time, though, we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking a little bit about how I got into anime in the first place, because I think that it really was one of the ways in which I became kind of the person I am in terms of the media that I consume and sort of the TV shows that I watch and don't watch, and the movies that I enjoy and video games and so on and so forth. So when you're getting a grasp of like why I like such and such an anime or why I don't like such and such an anime, it's probably going to make sense knowing why I sort of developed the way I did. So I've watched anime to a certain degree my entire life, but I didn't always contextualize it as being something that was culturally distinct. When I was growing up, I would watch something like, say, Kurobe on television, or I would watch Pokemon because everyone watched Pokemon, or I would watch something like Dragon Ball, any of those sorts of shows that was just on television. But the reason I didn't contextualize these as being a distinct thing was because the way that they were localized, the way that their stories function, they're really not all that different from what we have here. For a couple of them, there's a greater emphasis on adventure, which is just now becoming a big thing in Western television. Things like Adventure Time, or things like Avatar: The Last Airbender. So things in the last 10 years maybe in the West has sort of taken that, but that wasn't really something that I really thought of as distinct at the time. So the fact that Pokemon was all about going on a grand adventure, that doesn't really matter to me. It can be set in one town, it can be set across multiple different towns. It doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned in terms of storytelling. But one of the things that was sort of different about the way I approached it even back then, and this is with the heavy dose of retrospective viewing, I've got the ability to look back in time and sort of see what I was watching and sort of understand what I was interested in, what I wasn't. I'm able to sort of guess at what it was that I found interesting or less interesting about these. Now, when I talk about these cartoons that I didn't really care much for back in the 90s when I was a kid growing up, I didn't dislike them, and I still don't to this day. If you were to show me like a Transformers cartoon, I don't dislike that. I'm not going to say that's, a terrible show, or that it's really badly done, or that's boring. I'm not going to say that it's exciting or immersive either, though. I'm fairly neutral on these. Like, if it's on, I'll watch it. I'll probably even enjoy it. But I'm not going to really take it in. I'm not going to think about it very much. I'm not going to sort of internalize it as something important to my life like a lot of other people did. So the reasons that I think I didn't was because a lot of the shows from that time period were really focused around the idea of these really flimsy antagonists. If you sort of watch something like, say, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you've got Shredder and Krang. These guys have very stupid motivations and very limited or non-existent character development. And this is true for a lot of characters from that time period, like, say, Skeletor or Megatron, or any of those other sorts of antagonists. Dr. Claw, they're all very one-dimensional. They're all very evil for evil's sake. They don't really make a lot of sense in any sort of realistic sort of setting there. And that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, this means that the show is focusing a lot of attention and time on a very marketable, very bland character, which in my mind is not really all that entertaining to watch. So a lot of the story potential gets wasted on these very useless characters, and a lot of people really, really liked these characters. I think that a lot of people just thought that the villains were innately more cool than the good guys, and just because they thought they were cool, they thought they were interesting. I'd never had that reaction to them in the same sort of way. That's kind of like how I think a lot of people really like Darth Vader, a lot of people really like Boba Fett from the original Star Wars, and I just didn't. Darth Vader is kind of interesting because he has an interesting backstory, but he's not super interesting as a villain to me. But in any event, that sort of carried forward throughout my life. Unlike other, right now, if you were to watch a new modern day show set in some sort of whatever from a Western animation company or a Western television company, it's going to have a multi-layered complex villain, or that villain might even be the protagonist. But because I grew up sort of, I think, subconsciously disliking those particular types of characters, I came across the sort of situation where I just don't care about those characters right now. I don't care about antagonists in fiction. And so the story has to be propelled forward by forces outside the antagonist in a way that's interesting without him. And if the entire dynamic of everything hinges on that character being interesting, because of that sort of inherent bias that I've got, it becomes very flat for me. And this is why a lot of the things that I do like have got an antagonist that is in the series potentially, but is so flimsy as to be basically absent throughout the entire thing. I would argue that, for example, Code Geass, the antagonist of that series, would be Charles v. Britannia, arguably. I've also said that you could frame it as being Suzaku, of course, but he doesn't really work as a proper antagonist by the end of the series anyway, so it's hard to say for sure that that's what he actually is, although you could definitely frame it that way. So the ones that are the sort of flimsy, they are the definite villain sort of types, they're not developed at all, and their motivations are kind of stupid, and they're not very interesting, but because the story goes to tremendous lengths to not really care about them by not featuring them at all throughout the entire series, it really ends up being much more okay to me because they're not wasting their time on it, and everything else, all the other characters, all the other personal conflicts, and all the other ideological drives are what propel the story forward instead of the villain. Whereas in your typical episode of, say, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it's really being propelled forward by the machinations of the particular villain of that particular episode. So that was just something that I didn't really like all that much. And this is where we get into the first anime that I really liked, and that would be Cardcaptor Sakura. That was really weird inflection. Anyway, this was a cartoon that, I still didn't really visually think of it as something other than a cartoon. I didn't think of it as being something special or unique. But I did really like it, and I think that in retrospective, one of the major reasons that I do like it is that it has such a strong emphasis on the character development and the interactions between each of the individual characters rather than on the Monster of the Week, which was a Monster of the Week formatted show. Every week there'd be a new card that would show up and they'd have to deal with it, and that would be the episode. And this format worked fine for it, but a lot of cartoons would have like an A plot and a B plot, and they would sort of jump back and forth between both of those, and that's sort of something that we see nowadays, or they would be broken into two shorter 10-minute episode storylines. That was also something that happened a lot in older cartoons. But in this one, they would spend half the time developing the character relationships and the other half the time developing the plot. So you ended up with a much more sort of personal feeling one where it wasn't being propelled forward by the antagonistic forces. And the second part of this is that it didn't really have an antagonist. And that meant that there was far more time that could be spent on those sort of character relationships. And that was one of the reasons why I like Clamp's work so much, is that they tend to have that sort of format to them. So let's go into the other thing that, I didn't really care much for in terms of old-fashioned cartoons. So the second factor that really sort of doesn't really do it for me in cartoons or any media really is the sort of prevalence of the 3-act structure. This isn't too bad in movies where they're allowed to end after the resolution on any variety of things, but for an episodic series, it has to end in a sort of state where the last beat of the episode needs to be something that brings them back to the status quo of the start of the episode. And this is something that people have made explicit when they're talking about how the structure of an episodic series needs to go. Dan Harmon, for example, discusses in length about the sort of cyclical nature of the way that he writes Rick and Morty and everything that he believes that it should be. And this is a sort of technical necessity for a lot of cartoons and for a lot of sitcoms and a lot of other sorts of shows in that sort of genre, where Nothing's really allowed to change. And while people are sort of willing to do a sort of meta commentary on that sometimes, generally speaking, this is the formula that people are using. Something happens at the beginning that brings our characters out of their comfort zone, there's a conflict, and then it gets resolved. And this formula is fine. There's nothing particularly wrong with it. It's something that I'm capable of watching, and I'm perfectly fine with it, and I'm perfectly happy seeing it, but it's not going to blow my mind, or it's not going to be super interesting, or I'm not going to be super invested in this sort of way of doing things. So the problem that I've got with this is that it makes the plot very predictable, even extremely early on. We know approximately what's going to happen in any given episode of any episodic type of show, because we know that it has to return to the status quo by the end of the episode, in some sort of sense. Yeah, there can be some level of like character development, and that can be interesting. The idea, I think, that behind the 3-act structure and using it in the episodic format is that the conclusion isn't really the interesting part, it's the journey. The problem is that the journey takes the same sort of curves every time. The journey itself starts to become a little bit dull and predictable. And this is something that you typically see just in any sort of show that is, expected to run for X amount of time. There are certain shows certainly that are expected to end, but even these ones, generally speaking, will follow this 3-act structure. The other reason that people are going to use it, other than the sort of easy cyclical nature of it, is that 3-act structure of inciting incident, conflict resolution is a really easy way to do drama when having sort of one force being opposed by another. When there's a bad guy and a good guy, when there's any sort of antagonism going on there, this is a really easy way to set that up and frame it so that people are going from one end of the episode to the other with some obvious goal in mind and someone opposing that, and then they sort of overcome that by the end of the episode. If you're trying to make it about this dynamic of a hero and a villain, and you're not following this formula, it becomes very difficult to frame it in a way that's sort of satisfactory and which is exciting. So it's a very simplified tool for people who are trying to write that kind of story, and it's hard to write something that doesn't follow something following that pattern if you're going to do that kind of story. And as we've already sort of established, I don't care about antagonists as the main driving point for the story. So when you're using this structure because you're having a clash between a hero and a villain, that by definition is using that structure because the antagonist is what's driving the plot forward. So it becomes obvious that I'm not going to be invested in that sort of situation. And yeah, there are other ways to use this 3-act structure without having it be about a conflict between two people. But that's sort of more... It still follows the same structure. It still feels just as predictable as it does if there's an actual physical opponent, an antagonist to the story. So this is generally speaking why I don't necessarily like this framework. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. There's no reason to not use this. And I watch series that follow some variation of this formula, and I enjoy them. I find them to be fun to watch, but they're not the things that I really obsess over, or I really get into, or I really want to dig deeper into. And breaking from this doesn't automatically make something good either. If something's breaking away from a general structured pattern that is known to be good, and the person doing it is not talented enough to get away with it, then it's going to come out a bit of a mess. But on the other hand, when there's a solid reason behind why you would want to reject the 3-act structure and do something else instead, well, that makes it so that if that person has enough talent to pull it off, it can become much more interesting because it becomes much harder to predict and understand what's going on in the story. And that sort of lack of predictability makes it much easier for me to get drawn in and to be more invested in the story. And this brings us to Neon Genesis Evangelion. This was the first anime that I really got into where I watched it and realized that there were a lot of things that I just wasn't getting from Western television, North American television in particular. If I actually go over to Britain, Britain actually produces some stuff that I think fits my sort of sensibilities quite well as Japan does. Must be something about these sort of weird like island nations that makes them better at making stuff that I like, but yeah, we'll avoid talking about that for now. So Neon Genesis Evangelion, I think, was a bit of an eye opener for me, but at the time I didn't realize one thing about it. Neon Genesis Evangelion, at the time of its release, was a bit of an oddity in its own right. Even in Japan, it was a bit of a weird series, and it really wasn't supposed to be what it was, and it really didn't have any precedent in terms of other series that were like it, in any sort of relevant sense. So it itself was a pioneering, revolutionary sort of anime that paved the way for a whole bunch of other stuff that I was later able to sort of benefit from, because I was able to enjoy those sort of off-kilter, weird series that were interesting in their own sort of way. But at the time, I didn't know that, so I watched Evangelion and I thought it was really good. It was something that made me want to watch more things like that. And thankfully, by the time that Evangelion had been localized and I had eventually gotten around to getting my hands on it, because I certainly didn't see it at release or anything, there were other series that had taken advantage of it and were coming out that had similar themes and ideas and quirkiness. And a lot of the series at that time, it really sort of pushed away any desire to watch a lot of the Western television, because you now had this thing that was experimenting, it was doing different things, it was talking about more interesting themes and philosophies and ideas and psychology than you would ever get, and which we still don't get in Western media to a very large extent. Yeah, Game of Thrones has like politics and intrigue, but it doesn't really have much to say, in all honesty. It's just, dark, gritty for the sake of being dark and gritty. Lots of people die because that's apparently interesting if people die. And it doesn't really have any core messages. It's not really analyzing anything. There's nothing personal about it, in my opinion. There might be to much more avid readers, but, I couldn't get past the first few books of that series. So this was a series, Evangelion, that had a lot of things going for it. For one thing, it doesn't really have an antagonist, or it doesn't have a clearly definable antagonist. On a surface level, when you watch it, you could easily say, well, the angels are clearly the antagonist. Except that they're not really blocking Shinji's path, and they're not really opposing Shinji in any way, shape, or form. They're barely even cognizant of him existing, and neither he nor they really care about each other in any personal sense, and their objectives are sort of slipping past each other. In fact, I would say that Shinji's actual goal is being facilitated somewhat by the angels existing, since what he wants is an internal sort of state of acceptance, or he wants acceptance from other people, or he wants acceptance from his father. And any three of those personal goals are actually being facilitated by the angels being around, because they give him the sort of goal of being able to defeat them using the Eva, and defeating things with the Eva makes him more in the eye, more something in the eyes of all of those people to a certain degree. So it's difficult to say if those are supposed to be actually the antagonist of the series, or if Gendo is supposed to be the antagonist of the series, or if Shinji's own internal mental state is supposed to be the antagonist of the series, or if Seele is the antagonist of the series. Any of those could be a viable antagonist, but it's really unclear as to which one, in fact, is the antagonist. And it feels more like there's just a whole bunch of different people who all have their own intrinsic motivations, and sometimes those motivations cause troubles for other people. And that feels so much more real than this idea of this guy's the villain and he automatically has to do everything in his power to stop the hero from getting what he wants, and vice versa. So that already feels a lot more interesting to me. They're not wasting any time on sort of flimsy antagonists that I don't really care about. Now, in this sense, the angels are kind of the classic antagonists. They're completely depersonalized to a point which is absolutely ridiculous. And they have no personality, no motivation, or stated goals whatsoever. They're just this complete Cthulhian sort of mystery. But they spend so little time actually on the angels that it makes it sort of very forgivable for me, since, again, they're not really developing them or talking about them. They're a plot device. They're there for Shinji to sort of beat, or for Asuka to beat, or whoever else. And that's not the core sort of drive of the series in any way, shape, or form. So this lack of antagonist is something that I really like. But One of the other things that is interesting about Eva is that it has a very atypical sort of structure that makes it hard to predict what's going to happen in a given point in time. If we were to take the sort of line that people generally draw when they're doing the act structure for any given work, Neon Genesis Evangelions is sort of all over the place. It starts off with this really sort of sharp high with the military action against like the first angel, and I'm going to be using the wrong names because I can't remember the actual numbers. It's not actually the first angel, but the first one that they encounter in the story, fighting against the helicopters and then getting nuked. Like, it's off to a really, really powerful start in terms of action and sort of climax and suspense there. And then it just jumps off a cliff into this sort of long string of character development and techno babble. And then it brings up a little bit more tension when it's about Shinji piloting the Eva. Then he gets into it and then he gets basically stomped into the ground, and that's the end of the first episode. Like, in terms of structure, this starts off at somewhere high and then it jumps off a cliff and then it sort of builds slowly back up, like very, very slowly. And then it ratchets up very, very quickly. The sort of time interval between him actually deciding to pilot the Eva and getting in there and then getting out there and getting his ass kicked is really short, the time interval in that sort of exchange. And then the episode ends at the climax, at the lowest, most tense point of how does he get out of this? And we can say that this is a cliffhanger for what is supposed to be a 2-episode storyline. And to a certain degree, that's what this is, because it gets resolved in the second one. But then we get into the second episode. The end of the first episode is he gets into the Eva, and it doesn't even get to the point where he gets his ass kicked yet, if I recall correctly. I can never remember exactly where the episode breaks are. But no, he doesn't get his ass kicked just yet. So, it's just before the climax is where they decide to end it, and there's that sort of cliffhanger of how is he going to get out of this. We get to the second episode, and again, we start at the very top of him getting his ass kicked, and it's sort of the darkest hour sort of thing. It cuts to him in the hospital, and it sort of drops off a cliff again. And then we get the sort of long interlude of him adjusting to this new sort of family life dynamic that he's going to have with Misato or whatever. And then we get a flashback of him actually winning the fight, as though it was just something that wasn't necessarily important enough to show as is. It has to be shown as a flashback sort of thing. And we get all sorts of episodes that are structured not like this. Like, the first 2 episodes basically look like a valley where it starts off very intense, very high tension, very high suspense and all that. And then it drops into exposition and character development, and then it goes spiking back up into some sort of climax. And it sort of feels very unnatural the way that they sort of pace these episodes in a way that I think works really, really well. Because you start off every episode really excited about what's going on, and then you get to the sort of lull in the middle and you're really like, what's going on? And then you get to the ending and it makes you want to see the next episode. I almost think that like Eva works better as a binge watching series, which is weird because it was developed to be episodic. Later on, they sort of do iron it out and it becomes more 3-act structure in a certain way, but there's another strange element to Eva. The central tension of the series isn't actually supposed to be based around Shinji and his fights with the robots. To a certain extent, I think that the pacing and payoff is supposed to be based around his emotional state more than it is about the action. Because that's what the core themes and what the core plot is, or the core story is, I think. So it's a very, very different sort of story in terms of the way that it's structured. And because of that, I think that it made it more interesting to watch in a way that a lot of other series aren't. And of course, throw onto the fact that it's talking about very deeply psychological themes, and very introspective ones, and ones that I personally relate to on a very deep level. And you're looking at something that's going to be absolutely mind-blowing to me at the time. And from this, I started watching other series that are like it, and I'm more pulled into these ones, the ones that have something to say about the world, or which propose to have something to say about the world, about people, about ideas, about psychology. So generally speaking, I'm willing to watch anime that are very experimental, or ones that are very philosophical, and there's plenty that are out there that are like that, and I think that a lot of them can say that they owe Neon Genesis Evangelion for that state of being. And I think that, that just was what sort of drove me into this sort of medium as my preferred sort of medium. To a certain extent, I think I could have also read comics. Comics are also perfectly willing to explore these sort of much more mature and much more intelligent ideas without being too ham-fisted or stupid about it. There's plenty of things that profess to be more adult-themed and which just rely on grittiness, which I find are actually really juvenile. And I've always felt those to be really juvenile. But things that actually delve into these very intellectual, high-minded concepts do exist in the realm of superhero comic books. In particular, like Alan Moore is sort of notorious for being like that. The reason that I never really got into it is that it really is kind of the wrong medium for me. For some reason, I just don't really like superhero comics. Partly because of that sort of aversion to strong antagonists, which the superhero universe is really strongly built off of. And also just the same reason that I don't actually read or watch a lot of shonen series in the anime sort of style. For some reason, I just don't resonate well with a lot of the stuff that's distinctly marketed towards boys, like a lot of the sort of shonen action series. I'm not really sure why that is or why Ava would be an exception, although to be fair, I don't think Ava is really necessarily something that young teenage boys would be interested in necessarily by default. It feels sort of more like kind of like university student kind of thing that they would like, but who's to say? Maybe I'm wrong about that. So yeah, that's essentially what drew me into anime, and that's the sort of stuff that I look for and what I like. Now, if you look at what we have today in the anime community, a lot of it is episodic, formulaic trash, and that's fine. Like, that's always been the case. That's never not been the case. The thing is that it's a format which has allowed some of its creators to be more creative and inventive and to step outside the boundaries of those formulas. Whereas I think here in the West, we're really afraid to step away from that sort of formulaic way of writing. And when we do experiment, it's experiments in tone and style, but it's not experiments in structure, and it's not experiments in theme. And I really wish that, the stuff that we watch here would be more willing to step out into the realm of talking about new themes or ideas in a way that we don't now, and talking about structure in a way that we don't really talk about it. So in any event, that's just sort of the way I take it. Hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.